Winter owned Wyoming in 1887. It didn't just arrive, it conquered. Snow buried wagon trails until they vanished completely. Rivers froze so thick you could drive cattle across them, though most ranchers had already lost half their herds to cold that split wooden fence posts like kindling. Temperatures dropped so low that men woke with ice crusted inside their beards, their breath crystallizing before it left their lungs. Red Hollow, a settlement of maybe 200 souls scattered across the valley floor, locked itself down tight. The trading post reduced hours. The saloon became the only warm building people gathered in after dark, though fights broke out more frequently when cabin fever set in. Families rationed food, children wore coats indoors, and everyone counted days until spring with the grim awareness that not all of them would survive to see it. Colt Mercer didn't care about any of that. He lived 15 miles outside town on Blackthorn Ranch, a sprawling property backed against mountain foothills where pine trees grew so dense they blocked sunlight even in summer. The ranch house itself was a 2-story log structure built by hands long dead, weathered gray by decades of storms, surrounded by corrals and outbuildings that sagged under snow accumulation. Smoke rose constantly from the stone chimney, the only sign of life visible from the distant road. People in Red Hollow called Colt the Iron Rider, though never to his face. The nickname came from years of reputation, not affection. He had survived range wars that killed better men. He'd tracked outlaws through territory so hostile even marshals refused the work. And he'd put down 3 claim jumpers in a single afternoon with such cold efficiency that witnesses still wouldn't speak about it over drinks. Colt was 34 years old, built like someone who broke horses for entertainment, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter rivers. Gray, unreadable, frozen over. Scars marked his knuckles and one side of his jaw. He moved through the world like violence was a language he spoke fluently, but chose to keep silent unless provoked. He'd been alone at Blackthorn for 3 years. Alone was safer. Alone didn't betray you. Alone didn't die in your arms while you rode through a blizzard trying to reach help that arrived too late. But alone also meant cooking your own meals, mending your own shirts, and spending months listening to nothing but wind howling through gaps in the barn walls. By the 3rd winter, even Colt admitted the solitude was wearing him down. So one morning in late November, he rode into Red Hollow and posted a notice outside the trading post. Wanted. Ranch cook. Must work hard. No trouble. Inquire at Blackthorn. The notice hung for 2 weeks without response. Nobody wanted to work for Colt Mercer. Mothers told daughters to stay clear of him. Men respected his ability to survive but wanted no part of his life. And the few desperate drifters who might have considered the job took one look at Blackthorn Ranch's isolated location and kept riding. Colt had almost given up on finding help when Delilah Boone arrived. She came on a Thursday morning, the kind of day where the cold hurt to breathe and frost covered everything in crystalline silence. Colt was outside splitting firewood when he heard the wagon. The sound carried strangely in frozen air. Creaking wheels, a struggling animal, voices too faint to distinguish. He set down the axe and walked toward the front gate, pulling his coat tighter against wind that cut through fabric like it wasn't there. What he saw stopped him completely. A wagon lurched up the snow-packed road, barely moving. The mule pulling it looked half dead, ribs visible even through winter coat, breath coming in ragged clouds. The wagon itself was falling apart, one wheel wrapped in rope to hold the rim together, canvas cover torn and flapping, contents threatening to spill with every jolt. But it was the people inside that caught Colt's attention. 4 women. No men, no guns visible, no business being out here alone. The woman driving sat hunched against the cold, reins wrapped around hands covered in fingerless gloves. She was big, not just tall, but broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, the kind of size that made cheap coats strain at the seams. Her face was wind-burned red, dark hair pulled back in a braid that hung heavy with ice crystals. She looked exhausted in a way that went deeper than one bad night's sleep. Behind her sat 2 younger women, teenagers maybe, wrapped in blankets and pressed together for warmth. And beside them, an elderly woman who looked like she'd already died but was too stubborn to lie down. The wagon rolled to a stop 20 feet from the gate. Colt didn't move. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The mule wheezed, snow fell in lazy spirals, and the woman driving stared at Colt like she was trying to decide whether to speak or just turn the wagon around. Finally, she cleared her throat. You Colt Mercer? Her voice carried despite the wind, not loud, but steady, controlled, like someone who'd learned not to show fear even when drowning in it. I am. You posted a notice for a cook. Colt studied her. Notice said one cook, not 4 people. I know what it said. She didn't look away. I can cook. They can help with cleaning, mending, anything else you need. We don't eat much. We won't cause trouble. Where's your husband? Don't have one. Father? Brother? Dead. Both of them. So you're traveling alone. We've been traveling alone for 8 months. Colt glanced at the wagon's condition, the dying mule, the way the youngest girl in back had her hands tucked under her arms, fingers too pale. Then he looked at the woman again. Really looked. Past the size everyone else would focus on. Past the desperation she was trying to hide. And he saw something he recognized. Survival. Not hope, not optimism, just the grim determination of someone who'd already lost too much to quit now. I asked for one cook, he said again, quieter this time. I know. She held his gaze. But my sisters need shelter. My aunt needs warmth, and I need work. If you turn us away, we'll freeze before we reach the next settlement. So I'm asking, please, just through winter, I'll work harder than anyone you've ever hired. I won't complain, I won't steal, I won't cause problems. Just give us a chance. Colt should have said no. Every instinct told him to refuse. More people meant more complications, more mouths to feed, more chances for disaster. He'd spent 3 years alone specifically to avoid this kind of entanglement. But then the youngest girl coughed, a wet, rattling sound that didn't belong in healthy lungs. And when she lowered her hands, Colt saw the frostbite spreading across her fingertips, white and waxy against red skin. He was already walking toward the house before he consciously decided to move. Bring them inside, he said over his shoulder. All of you. The woman's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Relief, maybe. Or just the beginning of it. Thank you, she said. Colt didn't respond. He just pushed open the ranch house door and stepped into warmth that suddenly felt inadequate for 5 people instead of 1. Behind him, the wagon started moving again. And Colt Mercer's 3 years of solitude ended with the sound of boots crunching through snow toward his front porch. The first thing Delilah Boone noticed about Blackthorn Ranch was how quiet it felt. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The house was built solid. Thick log walls, stone fireplace that dominated one side of the main room, heavy furniture that looked handmade decades ago. But it had the unmistakable atmosphere of a place where nobody lived, only existed. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no personal items except a rifle rack near the door and a single photograph on the mantel, face down. The kitchen made her wince. Dirty plates stacked in the basin, rust stains in the pump sink, a cast iron stove that probably hadn't been properly cleaned in months. The pantry held basics, flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, but no spices, no variety, nothing that suggested someone cooked for pleasure instead of just survival. This was a house where someone had given up on everything except staying alive. Delilah recognized the feeling intimately. Second floor has 3 bedrooms, Colt said, standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed. You can figure out who sleeps where. There's blankets in the chest upstairs. Firewood gets delivered to the porch every morning before sunrise. I split it at night. Water pumps outside, but there's a pitcher by the sink that I keep filled after dark so the line doesn't freeze. He spoke in short sentences, like he'd forgotten how to have actual conversations. Kitchen's yours if you're cooking. I eat twice a day, a morning and evening. Don't care what you make as long as it's hot. Barn's out back if you need anything from storage. Don't go into the north pasture after dark. Wolves. Delilah listened carefully, committing everything to memory. Behind her, her sisters Clara and May stood close together, wide-eyed and shivering despite the fire. Aunt Judith had already claimed a chair near the hearth and looked like she might never move again. We'll earn our keep, Delilah said. I promise. Colt's gaze flickered toward her, then away. You already said that. Don't need to hear it twice. I just want you to know, I don't need to know anything except whether you can cook. His voice stayed flat. Not cruel, just absent of warmth. If you can't, say so now before we waste time. Delilah felt her jaw tighten. She'd dealt with harsh men before. Men who looked at her size and assumed incompetence. Men who spoke to her like she was a burden they tolerated instead of a person they respected. But she'd also learned not to react. "I can cook," she said evenly. "Then do that. I'll be in the barn if you need something." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a solid thud that seemed to suck remaining warmth from the room. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Clara, 16 years old with their mother's delicate features and their father's stubborn chin, whispered, "He's terrifying." "He's lonely," Aunt Judith corrected, eyes still closed, voice raspy from cold. "Loneliness makes people hard. You'll learn that eventually." May, the youngest at 14, moved closer to the fire. "Do you think he'll really let us stay?" Delilah looked around the kitchen, at the work waiting, at the house that clearly needed a woman's touch, even if the man who owned it would never admit it. "He'll let us stay," she said quietly, "as long as we're useful." She didn't say the other part, the part she'd learned through years of rejection and humiliation. That being useful was the only value people saw in her anymore. But Red Hollow found out about the women at Blackthorn Ranch within 48 hours. In a town that small, information traveled faster than weather. The shopkeeper's wife mentioned seeing an unfamiliar wagon heading toward Mercer's property. The blacksmith's apprentice claimed he'd heard female voices when he delivered horseshoes. And by Sunday morning, when Delilah walked into the general store to buy cornmeal and sugar, half the town already knew exactly who she was. The recognition wasn't kind. Delilah felt eyes tracking her the moment she stepped through the door. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Women at the fabric counter turned to stare. And the silence that followed her through the aisles felt heavy with judgment she'd experienced too many times to misunderstand. She kept her head up anyway. That was the trick. Never let them see you break. Never give them the satisfaction of knowing their cruelty landed. At the counter, she placed her items carefully and waited. The clerk, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetual frown, looked at her purchases, then at her face, then back at the items. "You're the Boone girl," he said. Not a question. "I am. Heard you're staying at Mercer's place." "That's right. Cooking for him?" "Among other things." The clerk's expression shifted into something unpleasant. "Among other things. I'm sure." Delilah's hands curled into fists beneath the counter, but her voice stayed calm. "How much for the cornmeal and sugar?" Behind her, someone laughed, a woman's voice, sharp and cruel. "I heard Colt Mercer finally found a woman desperate enough to tolerate him," the voice said, loud enough to carry. "Though I suppose beggars can't be choosers on either side." More laughter. Delilah didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the clerk, waiting for him to finish the transaction. But the voice continued. "Must be convenient, having a woman that size. Probably keeps the whole ranch warm just standing near the fireplace." The laughter grew louder. Delilah's face burned. Not from embarrassment. She'd stopped being embarrassed years ago. From rage. From the exhausting, endless indignity of being mocked for existing in a body people decided wasn't acceptable. The clerk finally named a price. Delilah paid, gathered her items, and walked toward the door with her spine straight and her expression blank. As she passed the group of women near the fabric counter, one of them, a blonde in an expensive coat, stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me," Delilah said quietly. "I'm just curious," the blonde said, smiling with teeth but not eyes. "How exactly does a woman like you end up working for a man like Colt Mercer? Did you answer the notice, or did he just take pity?" Delilah met her gaze without flinching. "I answered the notice. He hired me. That's the entire story." "Really? Because the way I heard it, you showed up with your whole family begging for shelter. That's not answering a notice. That's charity. Think whatever you want." Delilah tried to step around her, but the blonde moved again, blocking the path. "You know what people are saying, don't you?" Her voice dropped lower, almost confidential. "They're saying Colt Mercer's finally lost his mind, that the Iron Rider's gone soft, that he's letting some fat woman and her relatives drain his resources because he's too pathetic to say no." Delilah's jaw clenched. "Are you finished?" "I'm just trying to help you understand reality." The blonde's smile widened. You might have fooled Colt for now, but everyone knows you won't last. Winter's barely started. By February, he'll realize what a mistake he made. And when he throws you out, nobody in this town will lift a finger to help you, because we all know what you really are. And what's that? A burden too big for anyone to carry. The words hit exactly where they were aimed. Delilah had heard variations of that insult her entire life, from boys who'd courted her until they decided her size was shameful, from relatives who loved her but suggested she'd be happier if she lost weight, from strangers who felt entitled to comment on her body like it was public property. But hearing it now, in this store, surrounded by people who saw her as entertainment instead of human, something inside her shifted. She stepped forward, not aggressive, just close enough that the blonde had to either hold her ground or back up. The blonde backed up. "You're right about one thing," Delilah said softly. "I am big. I take up space. I always have. And I spent years apologizing for it, years trying to make myself smaller so people like you would be comfortable. But I'm done with that now." She leaned in slightly. "So if you want to insult me, go ahead. If you want to laugh at me, enjoy yourself. But don't mistake my silence for weakness. Because the only reason I'm walking away right now is that I have better things to do than teach you manners your mother should have handled years ago." Then she stepped around the blonde, pushed through the door, and walked into the cold without looking back. Behind her, the store erupted into furious whispers. But Delilah didn't care. She had cornmeal to carry home, and a man waiting who didn't care what size she was as long as dinner was ready. Colt noticed the change in Delilah that evening. She moved through the kitchen with tighter motions, jaw set, eyes focused on her work with an intensity that suggested anger barely contained. Dinner appeared on time: venison stew with carrots and onions, fresh biscuits that steamed when broken open, coffee strong enough to strip rust. It was the best meal Colt had eaten in 3 years. He didn't say that. He just ate in silence while Delilah served her sisters and aunt at the far end of the table, the 5 of them occupying space in his house like they'd always been there. The silence stretched until Clara, bless her naive heart, broke it. "Mr. Mercer," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" Colt glanced up. "You just did." "I mean, can I ask you something else?" "Depends on the question." Clara hesitated, then pushed forward with the fearless stupidity of teenagers everywhere. "Why do people in town call you the Iron Rider?" "Clara," Delilah warned, but Colt just shrugged. "Because I survived things that killed other men, and because people like giving nicknames to things that scare them. Makes it easier to talk about someone if you turn them into a story instead of a person." "Are you scary?" May asked, eyes wide. "To some people. Are you scary to us?" Colt considered that. "Do I seem scary to you?" May thought about it seriously. "No, you seem sad." The room went very quiet. Colt set down his fork. For a moment, Delilah thought he might get angry, might tell May to mind her business, might remind them all that his emotions were none of their concern. Instead, he just said, "Eat your dinner before it gets cold." But the way he said it, soft, almost gentle, suggested May had hit closer to truth than anyone expected. Bombwitz. That night, after everyone else went to bed, Delilah stayed in the kitchen cleaning up. She worked quietly, washing dishes in water she'd heated on the stove, organizing the pantry, scrubbing counters that probably hadn't seen soap in months. She didn't hear Colt approach until he spoke. "You don't have to do all that tonight." Delilah jumped slightly, then steadied herself. "I'm almost finished." Colt leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, watching her work. "Something happened in town today." It wasn't a question. Delilah kept washing dishes. "Nothing worth discussing." "People say something to you?" "People always say something." "What'd they say?" Delilah dried her hands slowly, considering whether to lie, then decided she was too tired for lies. "They said I'm too big for anyone to want. That you took pity on me. That I won't last the winter." She turned to face him. The usual things people say about women who look like me. Colt's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes went cold. Not toward her, toward the abstract concept of people who thought that was acceptable conversation. "You planning to leave?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I need this job." Because my sisters need shelter. And because I've been hearing versions of those insults my entire life. If I ran every time someone called me fat, I'd have never stopped running. Colt studied her for a long moment. Then he pushed off the doorframe and walked closer, stopping a few feet away. I don't care what you look like, he said bluntly. I care if you can cook, clean, and stay out of trouble. Everything else is noise. Delilah felt something tighten in her chest. Not quite gratitude, more like the beginning of it. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm being practical, not kind. I needed help. You needed work. That's the arrangement. He paused. But if someone in town bothers you again, you tell me. I'll handle it. I can handle it myself. I'm sure you can, but you don't have to. He left before she could respond, footsteps heavy on the stairs leading to his second-floor bedroom. Delilah stood alone in the kitchen, hands still damp from washing dishes, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Safe. Not completely. Not yet. But enough to sleep without one eye open. Enough to believe maybe, just maybe, this winter wouldn't destroy her. Barats. The next 3 weeks passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Delilah woke before sunrise to start coffee and begin breakfast. Colt ate quickly, then disappeared into the cold to handle ranch work, feeding animals, checking fences, splitting wood, the endless maintenance required to keep a property this size functioning. Clara and May helped with cleaning, mending, and keeping Aunt Judith comfortable while the old woman's health slowly improved in the warmth. Dinner became the only time they all occupied the same space. Colt still didn't talk much, but he listened when Clara chattered about books she'd read or when May asked questions about the ranch. And slowly, so slowly Delilah almost didn't notice, the house began feeling less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. But Red Hollow noticed too, and Red Hollow didn't approve. The gossip intensified. Men at the saloon made jokes about Colt going soft for a fat woman. Women refused to serve Delilah when she came to town for supplies. And twice, someone left nasty notes tucked into her wagon. Unsigned cowardice, calling her a whore, a leech, a disgusting burden. Delilah burned the notes without showing anyone, but the cruelty was wearing her down. Then came the morning, everything changed. Delilah walked into the general store to buy flour and found Jeremiah Crow waiting. Jeremiah was the richest cattle baron in the territory, a man in his 50s with silver hair, expensive clothes, and the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. He owned half the grazing land around Red Hollow, employed 40 men, and wielded influence like a weapon. He was also known for cruelty disguised as humor. When Delilah entered, Jeremiah stood near the counter, surrounded by 3 younger ranchers who laughed at everything he said like paid performers. He saw her immediately. "Well," Jeremiah announced loudly, "look who decided to show her face in public again." Delilah kept walking toward the counter, refusing to engage. "I heard Colt Mercer's hired help was a woman of substantial proportions," Jeremiah continued, voice dripping with mock curiosity. "But I didn't realize he'd employed someone who could double as livestock." The men around him roared with laughter. Delilah's hands trembled, but she forced herself to keep moving. "Just get the flour. Just pay. Just leave." "Honestly," Jeremiah said, stepping into her path, "I'm trying to figure out the logistics. Does Colt charge you rent by the pound? Because at your size, that ranch must be sinking into the foundation." More laughter. The clerk behind the counter didn't even pretend to look uncomfortable. Delilah stopped walking. She looked Jeremiah directly in the eyes and spoke clearly. "Excuse me, I need to reach the counter." "Oh, you need to reach something?" Jeremiah grinned. "Reach? That's funny. I'd imagine you need to reach a lot of things, like your own feet. Can you even see them anymore, or do you just navigate by memory?" The men howled, and something inside Delilah cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice under pressure, ready to shatter. She was about to respond, about to unleash years of accumulated rage and words that would feel good for 30 seconds before making everything worse, when the door behind her opened. Cold air rushed in, and Colt Mercer walked into the store. He took in the scene instantly, Delilah standing rigid, Jeremiah smirking, the other men laughing, the clerk pretending to organize shelves. Colt's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Jeremiah, Colt said quietly. Jeremiah turned, smile still plastered across his face. Colt, we were just having a conversation about your new employee. I heard. Oh, good. Then you'll appreciate. Colt moved so fast Jeremiah didn't have time to finish the sentence. One moment he was standing near the door. The next, his hand was wrapped around Jeremiah's throat, slamming the older man back against the wall with enough force to rattle jars on nearby shelves. The laughter died instantly. You want to say that again? Colt's voice stayed eerily calm. Because I don't think I heard you correctly. Jeremiah's face turned red. Colt? I was just what? Just insulting a woman who's done nothing to you? Just making jokes because you think your money makes you untouchable? Colt's grip tightened. Jeremiah struggled, hands clawing at Colt's wrist. You're making a mistake. No, you made the mistake. Colt leaned closer. That woman is under my protection. That means if you insult her, you insult me. And if you insult me, I stop being civilized. He held Jeremiah against the wall for another long moment, letting the threat sink in, then released him. Jeremiah collapsed, gasping, one hand on his throat. Colt turned to the other men who'd backed away like they were trying to blend into the walls. That goes for all of you, he said. Delilah Boone works for me. She's earned her place at Blackthorn Ranch. And the next person who says something disrespectful about her size, her family, or anything else will answer to me personally. Are we clear? Silence. I said, are we clear? Mumbled agreements. Good. Colt walked to the counter, paid for Delilah's flour without asking the price, then turned to her. Let's go. Delilah followed him outside in stunned silence. They walked to where their horses were tied. Colt had ridden into town specifically because he'd seen Delilah's wagon heading this direction and wanted to make sure she was safe. He handed her the flour. You didn't have to do that, Delilah said finally. Yes, I did. They'll make it worse now. They'll talk. Let them talk. Colt mounted his horse. I've been called worse things than a man who defends his employees. I'm not just an employee. The words came out before Delilah could stop them. Colt looked down at her, expression unreadable. No, he said quietly. You're not. Then he rode away, leaving Delilah standing in the snow with flour in her arms, and the first real flutter of hope she'd felt in years. Because Colt Mercer, the Iron Rider, the man nobody dared challenge, had just declared war on Red Hollow. For her, the ride back to Blackthorn Ranch happened in silence, but it was the kind of silence that said more than words could. Delilah kept the wagon steady while her mind replayed what had just happened. Colt's hand around Jeremiah Crow's throat, the way every man in that store had gone quiet, the look on Jeremiah's face when he realized money couldn't save him from violence. Nobody had ever defended her like that. Not her father, who loved her but told her to ignore cruel comments because fighting back only made things worse. Not the man who'd once promised to marry her, right up until he decided her size was too embarrassing to be seen with publicly. Not even her own mother, who'd suggested maybe if Delilah tried harder to be smaller, life would be easier. But Colt Mercer, a man who barely spoke, who kept everyone at arm's length, who seemed determined to feel nothing for anyone, had nearly killed someone for calling her fat. Delilah didn't know what to do with that information. When she reached the ranch, Clara and May rushed out to help unload supplies. They chattered about the mending they'd finished, the soup they'd started for dinner, how Aunt Judith had actually laughed at something May said. Normal things, sister things. Delilah let their voices wash over her while her hands went through familiar motions, carrying flour to the pantry, hanging her coat, checking the stove temperature. But her thoughts stayed stuck in that general store, watching Colt transform from quiet to lethal in the space of a heartbeat. She found him an hour later in the barn, brushing down his horse with methodical strokes that suggested he was thinking too hard about something. You didn't have to threaten Jeremiah Crow, Delilah said from the doorway. Colt didn't look up. Already told you. Yes, I did. He's the richest man in the territory. He employs half the county. People listen when he talks. So now he'll make trouble for you, for us. Jeremiah's been making trouble since before you arrived. This just makes it official. Delilah stepped into the barn, the smell of hay and horse and leather surrounding her. What does that mean? Colt set down the brush and finally turned to face her. Means Jeremiah's wanted access to my water rights for 3 years. Blackthorn sits on the best spring-fed creek in the valley. His cattle need water. I won't sell. So he's been trying to pressure me into leaving, buying up surrounding properties, making it harder to get supplies, spreading rumors that I'm dangerous to work for. And now he'll use me as ammunition. He'll try. That doesn't bother you? Colt's expression stayed flat. People have been talking about me since I was 20 years old. I stopped caring what they thought around the same time I realized their opinions don't change facts. Jeremiah wants my land. I'm not giving it to him. Everything else is just noise. Delilah crossed her arms. It's not just noise when they're insulting me to hurt you. No, Colt agreed quietly. It's worse than noise. It's cruelty. And I don't tolerate cruelty toward people under my roof. Under my roof. Like she belonged here. Like this wasn't temporary shelter, but something more permanent. The thought made Delilah's chest tighten in ways she didn't want to examine. I appreciate what you did today, she said carefully, but I need you to understand something. I've spent my entire life dealing with comments about my body, and I learned a long time ago that fighting back just makes it worse. People like Jeremiah thrive on reactions. If you ignore them, eventually they get bored and move on. Colt shook his head. That's not how men like Jeremiah work. They don't get bored. They escalate until someone stops them. And you're going to be the one who stops him? If necessary. What if stopping him gets you killed? The question hung between them. Colt stepped closer, close enough that Delilah had to tilt her head slightly to maintain eye contact. He wasn't a giant, but he was solid in a way that suggested immovable. I've survived range wars, claim jumpers, winters that killed better prepared men, and more bar fights than I can count, he said. Jeremiah Crow doesn't scare me, and I'm not going to stand by while he treats you like you're less than human just because your body doesn't match what small-minded people think women should look like. Delilah felt heat rise in her face. Not embarrassment, something else, something dangerous. Why do you care? She asked quietly. Colt held her gaze for a long moment before answering. Because you showed up here with nothing except pride and determination. Because you work harder than anyone I've ever hired. Because your sisters look at you like you hung the moon, and your aunt trusts you to keep them all alive. He paused. And because the first night you were here, I heard you crying in the kitchen after everyone went to bed. You thought nobody could hear, but I did. And I realized you'd been carrying weight that had nothing to do with your body for a very long time. Delilah's breath caught. She hadn't cried in months before that night, had held everything together through 8 months of traveling, through her father's death, through towns that turned them away, through humiliation after humiliation. But something about finally having shelter, finally having a warm place to sleep, had broken through her defenses. She'd allowed herself 5 minutes to fall apart. And Colt had heard. I didn't mean for anyone to know about that, Delilah said. I know, but now I do. And I'm telling you, you don't have to carry all that weight alone anymore. Not here. Not while you're under my roof. Before Delilah could respond, May's voice called from the house. Delilah, dinner's burning. The moment shattered. Delilah turned and hurried back toward the kitchen, her pulse racing in ways that had nothing to do with burnt soup. Behind her, Colt stayed in the barn. But the air between them had shifted into something neither of them knew how to name yet. The next week brought the kind of cold that made even breathing hurt. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze in buckets within minutes of being drawn from the well. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried fence posts. And the wind howled constantly, shaking the house at night like something alive trying to get inside. Delilah kept the kitchen warm. She cooked stews that lasted days, baked bread that filled the house with yeast and comfort, and rationed supplies with the careful precision of someone who'd gone hungry before. Clara and May helped without complaint, their hands growing rough from work, but their spirits lifting now that they had purpose instead of just survival. Aunt Judith improved daily. Color returned to her face. Her cough faded, and she started offering commentary on everything from how Delilah chopped vegetables to the way Colt tracked snow into the house without wiping his boots. That man needs a wife, Judith announced one afternoon while Delilah prepared dinner. He is a cook, Delilah replied without looking up. A cook isn't a wife. He didn't hire me to be a wife. No, but he looks at you like he's considering the option. Delilah's knife slipped, nearly catching her finger. He does not. Child, I'm 73 years old. I've seen men look at women in every possible way. And the way Colt Mercer watches you when he thinks nobody's paying attention? That's not employer to employee. That's something else entirely. You're imagining things. Am I? Judith smiled. Then explain why he rides into town with you now every time you need supplies. Explain why he fixed the squeaky hinge on your bedroom door without being asked. Explain why he started eating slower at dinner, like he's trying to make meals last longer. Delilah set down the knife. Aunt Judith, Colt is a practical man who needed help running his ranch. I provide that help. That's the extent of our arrangement. Keep telling yourself that. I will, because it's true. But even as Delilah said it, she knew her aunt had noticed what Delilah herself had been trying to ignore for weeks. Something was growing between her and Colt. Something neither of them had permission to feel. Something that would complicate everything if either of them acknowledged it. That night during dinner, Clara mentioned she'd seen riders watching the property from the hills earlier that day. Colt's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. How many? 3, maybe 4. They stayed up on the ridge for about an hour, then rode off toward town. What did they look like? Too far away to see details, but their horses looked expensive, not work animals. Colt set down his fork entirely, jaw tight. If you see them again, you tell me immediately. Don't go outside, don't approach them, just find me. May's eyes widened. Are they dangerous? Anyone watching this property without permission is dangerous. But why would someone watch us? May pressed. Colt glanced at Delilah, something unreadable in his expression. People watch for lots of reasons, most of them bad. Delilah felt ice settle in her stomach. She knew exactly who those riders belonged to. After dinner, once her sisters and aunt had gone upstairs, Delilah found Colt loading rifles near the fireplace. It's him, she said quietly. Colt looked up. Who? Silas Grady. The name landed like a stone in still water. Colt straightened slowly. You want to explain who that is? Delilah sat down in the chair across from him, hands clasped in her lap to stop them from shaking. She'd avoided this conversation for weeks, hoping distance and winter would keep her past buried. But apparently, the past had followed her to Blackthorn Ranch. Silas Grady was my fiancé, she began. Colt's expression didn't change, but his hands went very still. Was. 6 years ago. We were supposed to get married in the spring. His father owned the largest ranch in Montana Territory. My father owned decent land with good water access. It made sense for the families to join. What happened? Delilah took a breath. My mother got sick, cancer. It took 2 years for her to die. During those 2 years, I gained weight. A lot of weight. I stopped eating carefully because I was too exhausted to care. I stopped exercising because I spent 16 hours a day caring for her. And by the time she finally passed, I looked nothing like the girl Silas had agreed to marry. She watched Colt's face, waiting for judgment, but he just listened. Silas didn't say anything at first. He was patient. Told me we'd postpone the wedding until I was ready. But what he really meant was, until I looked acceptable again. And when I didn't lose the weight fast enough, he started making comments. Little things. Suggestions about portion sizes. Questions about whether I'd been exercising. Compliments that were really criticisms. Delilah's hands tightened in her lap. Then one day, 6 months after my mother died, Silas invited me to a town social. I thought it meant he was ready to move forward. I wore my best dress, did my hair, tried to look presentable even though the dress barely fit anymore. Her voice went quiet. He broke our engagement in front of 300 people, stood up during the dance and announced that he couldn't marry someone who'd let themselves go so completely, that it was embarrassing to be seen with me, that he deserved better than a woman who clearly had no self-respect. Colt's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. Everyone laughed, Delilah continued. Or worse, they nodded like he was making a reasonable point, and I just stood there, frozen, while the man I'd loved humiliated me for something I couldn't control. My father tried to defend me, but it was too late. The damage was done. Our family's reputation was destroyed. Where's Silas now? That's the problem. Delilah met Colt's eyes. About a year after he broke our engagement, Silas discovered something. Oil. Beneath my family's land. Not enough to make us rich, but enough to be valuable. He tried to buy the property from my father, offered a fair price at first, but my father refused to sell, said it was our legacy. She swallowed hard. Then strange things started happening. Fences cut, cattle poisoned, our barn burned down in the middle of the night. My father kept refusing to sell, kept fighting, until one morning we found him dead in his bed. The doctor said it was his heart, but there were bruises on his arms, and the land deed was missing from his desk. Colt's expression had gone dangerously calm. You think Silas killed him? I know he did. I just can't prove it. After the funeral, Silas showed up with papers claiming my father had agreed to sell before he died. Forged documents with a signature that looked close enough to fool a judge. My aunt and sisters and I ran before he could force us to sign over our rights. We've been moving every few months since then, staying ahead of his men. And now he's found you. Those riders Clara saw, I recognized one of the horses, a black gelding with white stockings. Silas always rode a horse like that. Colt stood up, walked to the window, and stared out into the darkness. Snow fell steadily, visible in lamplight from the house. Why didn't you tell me this before? He asked. Because I was hoping winter would slow him down. Because I thought maybe we'd gotten far enough away. Because... Delilah's voice cracked. Because I didn't want you to throw us out once you knew we brought danger with us. Colt turned to face her. You think I'd throw you out because someone's chasing you? Most people would. I'm not most people. I know. But that doesn't mean you signed up for a range war. Silas has money, men, influence. If he decides to come after me here, he won't stop until he gets what he wants. Colt crossed the room and crouched in front of Delilah's chair so they were eye level. Listen to me carefully, he said. I don't care how much money Silas has. I don't care how many men he employs. And I sure as hell don't care about his influence. This is my land. You're under my protection. And if he wants to take you from here, he'll have to go through me first. Delilah felt tears burning behind her eyes. You can't fight him alone. Watch me. Colt. No. His voice stayed gentle, but absolute. You came here looking for shelter. I gave it. That means something. It means I don't abandon people when things get difficult. It means I keep my word. And I'm giving you my word right now. Whatever happens, you're staying here. You and your sisters and your aunt. This is your home now. And I protect what's mine. The last sentence hung between them. What's mine? Not just property, not just employees, something more. Delilah reached out slowly and placed her hand over Colt's where it rested on the arm of her chair. His skin was rough, scarred from years of work, warm against her palm. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Colt looked at their joined hands for a long moment before answering. Because the first time I saw you standing in the snow outside my gate, you looked at me without fear. Everyone in Red Hollow treats me like I'm one bad day away from violence, like I'm dangerous to be around. But you just looked tired. And when I let you inside, you didn't try to change me or fix me or make me into something softer. You just cooked dinner and organized the pantry and made the house feel less empty. His thumb moved slightly against her hand. Nobody's ever made my life better just by existing in it before. And I'm not letting some rich bastard with forged documents take that away because he thinks money makes him entitled to whatever he wants. Delilah's vision blurred. She'd spent years being told she was too much, too big, too loud, too demanding, too difficult to love. And here was Colt Mercer, the Iron Rider, the man nobody dared challenge, telling her she made his life better just by being herself. I don't know what to say, she managed. Don't say anything. Just trust me. I do trust you. Then let me handle Silas. Before Delilah could respond, the window behind Colt exploded inward. Glass shattered. Cold air rushed in, and something heavy hit the floor near the fireplace, trailing sparks. Colt moved faster than thought. He grabbed Delilah, yanked her from the chair, and threw both of them behind the heavy oak table just as the object near the fireplace ignited. Fire bloomed across the floor. Not normal fire. Something chemical. Something that spread too fast and burned too hot. Upstairs, Colt shouted. Get your family out. Delilah scrambled toward the stairs while Colt grabbed blankets to smother flames. She could hear Clara screaming, May crying, Aunt Judith's voice sharp with fear. Fire, Delilah yelled. Everyone outside, now! She helped Aunt Judith down the stairs while Clara and May grabbed coats. Smoke filled the house already, thick and choking. The fire spread across the floor like a living thing, consuming everything it touched. They made it to the front door just as the kitchen window exploded. Another bottle. More fire. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains. Delilah pushed her family toward the barn, while behind them, Blackthorn Ranch burned. Colt appeared through the smoke, face black with soot, carrying the rifles he'd been loading earlier. "How many?" Delilah asked. "At least 6, maybe more." "Where?" "Everywhere." As if to prove his point, gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets punched into snow, into the side of the barn, into fence posts. Colt returned fire without hesitation, his shots precise even in darkness and falling snow. "Get inside the barn," he ordered. "Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone except me." "What are you going to do?" "What I'm good at." He kissed her, quick, hard, desperate. Then he was gone, running toward the tree line where muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. Delilah herded her family into the barn, threw the heavy bar across the door, and tried not to think about Colt out there alone against 6 armed men. She failed completely. For the next 20 minutes, gunfire echoed across the valley. Delilah counted shots, trying to track how many shooters were still active. Clara and May huddled together in a corner. Aunt Judith sat on a hay bale, eerily calm, like she'd seen worse in her 73 years. Then silence. Complete, absolute, more terrifying than the gunfire. Delilah pressed her ear against the barn door, listening. Nothing. She waited. Still nothing. "Maybe they left," May whispered. "Or maybe they're waiting for us to come out," Clara replied. Aunt Judith stood up slowly. "Or maybe Colt killed them all." A knock on the barn door made everyone jump. "Delilah," Colt's voice, rough, exhausted. "Open up." Delilah lifted the bar with shaking hands and pulled the door open. Colt stood in falling snow, covered in blood that might have been his or might not, face grim, but eyes alive. "Are you hurt?" Delilah demanded. "Nothing serious." "That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting right now." He looked past her at Clara and May and Aunt Judith. "Everyone inside okay?" They nodded. "Good. Stay here while I check the property. Colt, stay here, Delilah." He left before she could argue. Delilah stood in the barn doorway, watching Blackthorn Ranch burn. Flames consumed the house she'd worked so hard to make into a home. Smoke rose into snow-filled sky, and somewhere in the darkness, 6 men who'd tried to kill them were either dead or running. When Colt returned 30 minutes later, his expression told her everything she needed to know. 4 dead, he said quietly. 2 got away. I tracked them to the road, but they had horses waiting. Was Silas with them? No. He sent hired guns, coward. Delilah looked at the burning house. We've lost everything. No. Colt moved to stand beside her. We lost a building. Everything that matters is still breathing. Where are we supposed to sleep? Where are we supposed to... Colt turned her to face him. We'll rebuild. The barn has enough space to make work until spring. I've got supplies stored in the north pasture shed, and come morning, I'm riding into Red Hollow to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here tonight. They won't care? They already think I'm trouble. Then I'll make them care. How? Colt's expression went cold in a way that reminded Delilah why people called him the Iron Rider. By reminding them what happens to people who attack what's mine. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the remains of Blackthorn Ranch. The house had burned down to its stone foundation, smoke still rising from charred beams that jutted toward the sky like broken ribs. Snow had dampened some of the fire overnight, leaving everything coated in a filthy mix of ash and ice that made the whole scene look like something out of a fever dream. Delilah stood outside the barn wrapped in a blanket, staring at what used to be her kitchen, the place where she'd kneaded bread, where she'd cooked her first meal for Colt, where just last night she'd held his hand and felt something shift between them into territory neither had permission to explore. All gone now. Behind her, Clara and May huddled near a makeshift fire Colt had built in a metal drum. Aunt Judith sat on a crate, staring at nothing, her face showing the kind of exhaustion that came from surviving too many disasters in one lifetime. Colt emerged from the barn carrying saddlebags and his Winchester. His face was still streaked with soot from last night, dried blood visible on his sleeve where something had caught him during the fight. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side in a way that told Delilah he was hurt worse than he'd admitted. You need to see a doctor, Delilah said. I need to get to Red Hollow. You can barely stand. I'm standing fine. Colt equipot. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see how red his eyes were from smoke and lack of sleep. 4 men died on this property last night. The law needs to know about it before Silas spreads his version of what happened. And I need to make sure everyone in that town understands there are consequences for attacking Blackthorn Ranch. Let me come with you. No. This is my fight too. Which is exactly why you're staying here. Colt's voice softened slightly. Silas sent those men because of you. If you show up in town right now, it'll look like you're hiding behind me. It'll give people ammunition to say you manipulated me into protecting you. Delilah felt anger flash hot in her chest. I don't care what they say. Maybe not, but I do. Colt adjusted the rifle strap on his shoulder. When this is over, I want people to know you earned your place here through work, not through making me care about you, even if that second part is also true. The admission hung between them like visible breath in cold air. Making me care about you, not pretending anymore, not hiding behind practical reasons or employment arrangements. Just the raw truth neither of them had been willing to speak until violence forced it into the open. Delilah reached up and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of soot along his jaw. Be careful. Always am. That's a lie, and we both know it. Colt's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. Fair enough. How about this? I'll try not to get killed before lunch. That's barely an improvement. Best I can offer. He kissed her forehead, gentle and quick, then turned toward his horse. Within minutes he was gone, riding toward Red Hollow through snow that had started falling again, heavier now, like the sky wanted to bury everything under white silence. Clara moved to stand beside Delilah. He'll be okay, right? He survived a gunfight against 6 armed men last night. I think he can handle a conversation with the sheriff. That's not what I meant. Delilah looked at her sister. Clara was 16, technically still a child, but her eyes held the kind of awareness that came from watching your family fall apart and learning to survive anyway. What did you mean? Delilah asked. I meant, you love him, and he loves you. And people who love each other don't always survive the things trying to destroy them. The words hit harder than they should have. Delilah wanted to deny it, wanted to say it was too soon, too complicated, too dangerous to call what she felt love. But standing in the ruins of a house that had almost become a home, watching the man who'd defended her disappear into falling snow, denial seemed pointless. No, she admitted quietly. They don't always survive, but they try anyway. Because the alternative is giving up, and I'm done giving up. Clara nodded slowly. What do we do now? Delilah looked at the barn, at Aunt Judith sitting silent and exhausted, at May trying to stay warm by a fire that barely kept the cold at bay. Then she looked at the destroyed house, at the work waiting, at everything that needed rebuilding. Now, she said, we start over. Colt reached Red Hollow just after 9 in the morning. The town was already awake, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving between buildings. The usual rhythm of frontier life continuing like nothing had happened 15 miles away. He rode straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Brennan was 53 years old, overweight from too much sitting and too little exercise, with a mustache that drooped past his chin and eyes that had seen enough violence to recognize it approaching. He looked up when Colt walked in, took in the blood and soot and general appearance of a man who'd survived something terrible, and immediately reached for the whiskey bottle he kept in his desk drawer. Tell me it's not as bad as you look, Brennan said. Colt sat down without being invited. Worse. Someone attacked Blackthorn Ranch last night, burned the house, shot at my people. 4 of them are dead. Brennan poured 2 glasses and slid one across the desk. 4 of your people? 4 of theirs. I killed them. The sheriff's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. Christ, Colt. They threw fire bottles through my windows while women and children were inside. They shot at us when we tried to escape. I did what I had to do. Who were they? Hired guns. I didn't recognize any of them. You know who sent them? Colt drank the whiskey in one swallow. Silas Grady. Brennan's expression went carefully neutral. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. You have proof? Delilah Boone recognized one of the horses watching my property yesterday. Same horse Silas rode in Montana. And the timing's too convenient. She shows up here running from him, and suddenly my ranch gets attacked by professional killers. Brennan leaned back in his chair. Delilah Boone, that's your new cook. That's right. The woman everyone in town's been talking about. Colt's jaw tightened. If by talking about you mean insulting, then yes. Colt, I'm not judging. I'm just establishing facts. Brennan rubbed his face. You're telling me Silas Grady, a wealthy rancher from Montana, sent armed men to burn down your house because you're sheltering a woman he used to be engaged to? I'm telling you Silas murdered Delilah's father to steal land with oil deposits. And now he's trying to eliminate witnesses who can prove he forged ownership documents. Can she prove any of this? She has the original land deeds, hidden somewhere safe. Where? Colt stood up. Somewhere Silas can't find them. That's all you need to know right now. Brennan stood too, his expression hardening. Listen to me carefully. I believe you about the attack. I believe 4 men died on your property last night. But if you're planning to ride after Silas Grady without evidence that'll hold up in court, you'll be the one facing murder charges. So what am I supposed to do? Wait until he tries again? You're supposed to let me handle this legally. The law didn't protect Delilah's father. Why would it protect her? Because I'm not a small-town sheriff in Montana who can be bought off. Brennan's voice stayed level. Give me the land deeds. Let me investigate Silas properly. If there's evidence he killed her father and forged documents, I'll bring him in. But you need to trust the system. Colt laughed, sharp and bitter. The system protects men with money. You know that as well as I do. Maybe. But vigilante justice protects nobody. They stared at each other across the desk. Finally, Colt said, I'll talk to Delilah about the documents, but I'm not making promises about what I will or won't do if Silas comes after her again. Fair enough. Just don't make me arrest you for something stupid. No guarantees. Colt left the sheriff's office and stood on the wooden sidewalk, watching Red Hollow move around him. People noticed him immediately. Hard not to notice a man covered in blood and soot standing motionless in the middle of town. Conversation stopped. Women pulled children closer. Men touched their hats in wary acknowledgement. The door to the general store opened and Jeremiah Crow stepped out. He saw Colt and stopped. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Jeremiah walked over, his expression unreadable. Heard you had trouble last night. You heard right. House burned down? To the foundation. Anyone hurt? 4 men who attacked us are dead. Everyone else survived. Jeremiah studied Colt's face. You look like you went through hell. I've been through worse. I don't doubt it. Jeremiah paused. I also heard Silas Grady might be involved. Colt's eyes narrowed. Where'd you hear that? I make it my business to know what's happening in this territory, especially when it involves rich bastards trying to take land that doesn't belong to them. Jeremiah's voice dropped lower. I'm not your friend, Colt. We both know that. I want your water rights, and I've made that clear. But there's a difference between business competition and hiring killers to burn down a man's home. You saying you don't support what Silas did? I'm saying I don't do business with men who attack women and children to get what they want. That's not competition. That's cowardice. Colt didn't know what to make of that. Jeremiah Crow was a lot of things. Greedy, opportunistic, willing to bend rules until they snapped. But he'd never been a coward. And he'd never targeted families. So what are you telling me? Colt asked. I'm telling you that if Silas Grady shows up in Red Hollow looking for support, he won't find it from me. And I'll make sure he doesn't find it from anyone else who values their reputation. Jeremiah adjusted his coat. I want your land, but I want to buy it fair, not inherit it after you're killed by some Montana rancher with delusions of power. It wasn't friendship, wasn't even really an alliance. But in a town that had spent weeks mocking Delilah and questioning Colt's judgment, it was more support than he'd expected. Appreciate that, Colt said carefully. Jeremiah nodded and walked away. Colt stood there a moment longer, processing this new development, then headed toward the saloon. If people in Red Hollow were going to talk about what happened at Blackthorn Ranch, he wanted to make sure they had the right story. Back at the ranch, Delilah worked. She couldn't rebuild the house. That would require lumber and supplies and time they didn't have. But she could organize the barn, make it livable. create spaces where her sisters and aunt could sleep with some semblance of privacy and dignity. Clara and May helped without complaining. They dragged hay bales to create walls, hung blankets to section off areas, swept floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. Aunt Judith, despite her age and exhaustion, organized their salvaged belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd moved too many times to waste energy on sentimentality. By noon, the barn had been transformed from storage space into something almost resembling a home. It wasn't comfortable. The wind still found gaps in the walls, the floor was dirt, and the smell of horse and hay permeated everything. But it was warm, and it was theirs. Delilah stood in the doorway looking out at the destroyed house and felt something unexpected. Determination, not hope exactly. Hope felt too fragile for what she was experiencing. But determination, that was solid. That was something she could build on. "We're not leaving, are we?" May asked from behind her. Delilah turned. May stood there wrapped in a quilt, her young face serious. "No," Delilah said. "We're not leaving. Even though Silas found us? Especially because Silas found us. I'm done running from him." "But what if he comes back? What if he brings more men?" "Then Colt and I will stop them again." May considered that. "You really love him, don't you?" It was the second time someone had said it out loud today. And this time, Delilah didn't hesitate. "Yes, I do." "Does he love you?" "I think so." "Then why haven't you told each other?" Delilah smiled despite everything. "Because love is complicated, especially when you're busy trying not to get killed." That seems like a bad excuse. It is a bad excuse. But it's the only one I have right now. May hugged her sister, small arms squeezing tight. Delilah held her close and tried not to think about how easily last night could have ended with May dead, burned alive in a house that was supposed to be safe. Footsteps approached through snow. Delilah tensed, one hand moving toward the rifle, leaning against the barn door. But it was just Colt, riding back from town, his horse moving slow like both animal and rider had reached the end of their endurance. He dismounted stiffly and walked over. "How'd it go?" Delilah asked. "Sheriff knows what happened. He wants the land deeds so he can investigate Silas properly." "And you said?" "I said I'd talk to you about it." Delilah looked at the burned house. "They're hidden in my wagon, inside a false bottom under the driver's seat. My father built it specifically to protect important documents. You want me to get them?" "No, I want to give them to the sheriff myself." Colt studied her. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about a lot of things suddenly, including the fact that I'm done hiding." Delilah straightened her shoulders. "Silas destroyed my family once by making me feel ashamed of who I am. I won't let him do it again. If he wants these deeds, he's going to have to face me directly instead of sending hired killers in the middle of the night." Something shifted in Colt's expression. Pride, maybe? A recognition that the woman he'd sheltered had steel running through her spine that matched his own. "Then we ride to Red Hollow together tomorrow," he said. "You give the deeds to Brennan. I make sure nothing happens to you while you do it." "What about Silas?" "What about him?" "He's probably already in town, waiting to see if his men succeeded. When he finds out they didn't, he'll try something else." "Let him try." Colt's voice went cold. "Every time he comes after you, he proves your story. Every attack makes your case stronger, and eventually he'll make a mistake big enough that even money can't save him." Delilah wanted to believe that, wanted to trust that justice would actually work for once, but she'd watched her father die believing the law would protect him, and he'd been wrong. Still, doing nothing meant staying a victim forever. And Delilah was done being a victim. That night, they ate dinner together in the barn. Delilah had managed to salvage some supplies from the smoking ruins of the kitchen, enough to make a thin stew that tasted mostly of smoke and desperation. But it was hot, and everyone was alive to eat it. Aunt Judith said grace even though Delilah had asked her not to. Old habits from a lifetime of prayer died hard. But she kept it short, just a quiet thanks for survival, and Delilah didn't have the heart to argue. After dinner, Clara and May settled into their makeshift sleeping areas. Aunt Judith claimed a corner near the stove Colt had rigged up, wrapped herself in blankets, and fell asleep almost immediately. Colt and Delilah stayed awake, sitting near the fire, not talking. Finally, Delilah said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For not running." Most men would have thrown us out the second they realized we brought trouble. I'm not most men. No, you're really not. Delilah looked at him in firelight, at the cuts and bruises visible on his face, at the way he held himself like someone waiting for the next attack. Can I ask you something? Depends. Why did you really let us stay that first day? And don't say it was practical. I know you well enough now to recognize when you're lying. Colt was quiet for a long time, then, you remember what May said earlier? About me seeming sad instead of scary? Yes. She was right. I've been sad for 3 years. Angry and sad and so goddamn lonely, I forgot what it felt like to have people in my house who weren't there to take something from me. He stared into the fire. My fiancée died 3 years ago. Emily. We were supposed to get married in June, but in March, raiders hit the settlement where she was staying with her family. I was 2 days away tracking stolen cattle. By the time I got there, the whole place had been burned. 15 people dead, including her. Delilah's chest tightened. I blamed myself, Colt continued. Thought if I'd been there, I could have stopped it, could have saved her. So I convinced myself that loving people only guaranteed pain, that staying alone was safer. What changed? You did. He looked at her. You showed up with nothing except a dying mule and 2 sisters and an old woman who should have frozen weeks ago. And you didn't ask for pity, didn't try to manipulate me with tears or guilt. You just asked for a chance to work, to prove you deserved shelter. His hand found hers in the darkness between them. And then you made my house feel like a home again, and suddenly I was eating real meals instead of jerky and whiskey. And suddenly there were voices in the hallways. And suddenly I remembered what it felt like to care whether I lived or died, because someone would actually notice if I was gone. Delilah's vision blurred. Colt, I let you stay because I was selfish, he finished. Because I wanted to remember what it felt like to be human instead of just a weapon. People pointed at problems. And now that I remember, I'm not letting you go. Not because of Silas, not because of fire, not because the whole territory decides you're not worth protecting. You're mine now. And I take care of what's mine. Delilah leaned forward and kissed him. Not gentle, not careful, just desperate and real, and full of everything she'd been holding back for weeks. Colt kissed her back like a man drowning who'd finally found air. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Delilah whispered, I love you. I know. You're supposed to say it back. I already did, just in more words. Delilah laughed despite everything. Despite the burned house and the dead men and the danger still circling. Because Colt Mercer, the Iron Rider, the most feared cowboy in Wyoming, had just admitted he needed her. And maybe that was enough. The next morning dawned clear and brutally cold. Delilah woke early, extracted the land deeds from her wagon's false bottom, and wrapped them in oilcloth to protect against snow. The documents were old, yellowed with age, but the signatures were clear. Her father's name. Witness marks from the county recorder. Everything needed to prove the Boone family owned that Montana land legally. Everything Silas had tried to erase. Clara helped her get ready, braiding her hair and making sure her coat was buttoned properly against the cold. May packed food for the ride, and Aunt Judith just watched with knowing eyes that suggested she understood exactly what this trip meant. You be careful, Judith said when Delilah was ready to leave. I will. And don't let anyone make you feel small. You're worth 10 of these frontier bastards on your worst day. Delilah smiled. I'll try to remember that. Don't try, know it. Colt brought the horses around, his own roan stallion and a gentler mare for Delilah. They mounted up and started toward Red Hollow, while behind them, Clara and May stood in the barn doorway watching until they disappeared into the tree line. The ride took 2 hours through snow that had drifted deep enough to make the horses work for every step. Colt rode slightly ahead, rifle across his saddle, eyes scanning the landscape for threats. Delilah followed, one hand on the oilcloth package, the other on her reins. Neither spoke much. What was there to say that hadn't been said last night? Red Hollow appeared gradually through falling snow, buildings emerging like ghosts, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of voices carrying strangely in cold air. They rode straight to the sheriff's office. Brennan was waiting, along with 2 deputies Delilah didn't recognize. He stood when they entered, his expression professionally neutral. Miss Boone, he said, Colt mentioned you might have documents related to your father's land. Delilah set the oilcloth package on his desk. Everything's there. Original deed, transfer papers from when my grandfather died, survey maps, and the letter my father wrote 3 days before he died explaining that Silas Grady had threatened him if he didn't sell. Brennan opened the package carefully and examined the contents. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. "This is substantial evidence," he said quietly. "Is it enough to arrest Silas?" "It's enough to bring him in for questioning. Whether it's enough to convict him of murder depends on what else we can find." "What else do you need?" "Witnesses. Anyone who saw Silas threaten your father. Anyone who can testify about the forged documents. Anyone who can place him near your property the night your father died." Delilah's heart sank. "Most of those people are dead or too scared to talk. Then we work with what we have." Brennan looked at Colt. "I'm sending a wire to the Montana Territory Marshal. If Silas committed crimes there, they'll want jurisdiction, but that takes time." "How much time?" Colt asked. "Weeks. Maybe months." "We don't have months. Silas already attacked us once." "Then you make sure he doesn't get a second chance." Brennan's voice hardened. "I'm putting you both on notice. If Silas Grady dies suspiciously before this investigation concludes, I'll be looking at you first. Understood?" Colt's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Delilah and Colt left the sheriff's office and stood on the sidewalk, both processing what just happened. "He's not going to arrest Silas," Delilah said quietly. "Not yet." "Which means Silas is free to try again." "Probably. So what do we do?" Before Colt could answer, a voice called out from across the street. Well, if it isn't the fat whore and her attack dog." Delilah turned. Silas Grady stood in front of the saloon, flanked by 4 men who looked like they killed people for entertainment. He was exactly as she remembered, handsome in a cold way, expensively dressed, with eyes that showed nothing except calculated cruelty. "Hello, Delilah," Silas said, smiling. "I heard you've been making quite a name for yourself in Red Hollow, living in sin with the local gunslinger. How very progressive of you." People on the street stopped to watch. Delilah felt Colt tense beside her, but she put a hand on his arm. This was her fight. "Silas," she said evenly, "still sending other men to do your dirty work, I see." "I don't know what you're talking about." 4 hired guns attacked Blackthorn Ranch 2 nights ago, burned the house, tried to kill everyone inside. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Silas's smile widened. "Sounds terrible. Did you report it to the sheriff?" "We did, along with the land deeds you've been trying to steal for 6 years. The smile faltered slightly. "Those deeds prove my father owned that land legally," Delilah continued, louder now so everyone watching could hear. "They prove you forged documents claiming he agreed to sell, and they prove you murdered him when he refused to cooperate. That's a serious accusation. It's the truth. Do you have proof?" "I have his signature. I have witness testimony. And I have a letter he wrote 3 days before he died explaining exactly what you threatened to do to our family." Silas's expression went cold. "That letter won't hold up in court." "Maybe not, but it'll be enough to make people ask questions. Questions about how many other ranchers you've threatened, how many other properties you've stolen, how many other families you've destroyed." The street had gone completely silent. Silas stepped off the sidewalk, moving toward Delilah with the confidence of a man who'd never faced consequences. Colt moved too, positioning himself between them. "That's close enough," Colt said quietly. "Or what?" Silas sneered. "You'll shoot me in the middle of town, in front of witnesses?" "If necessary." "You won't, because you're not stupid. You know killing me would end with you hanging." "Maybe, but you'd still be dead." They stared at each other. Then Silas turned his attention back to Delilah. "You really think anyone will believe you?" he asked. "You really think a jury will side with a fat woman who can't even keep a man without spreading her legs?" The insult landed exactly where it was aimed, but this time Delilah didn't flinch. She stepped around Colt and walked right up to Silas, close enough to see the surprise flicker across his face. "You're right about one thing," she said quietly. "I am fat. I always have been. And I spent years letting men like you use that as a weapon against me, letting you convince me I was worthless because my body didn't match what you wanted." She leaned in slightly. But I'm done with that now because I finally figured out the truth. You're not cruel because I'm fat. You're cruel because you're weak. And the only way you can feel powerful is by making other people feel small. Silas's face went red. So here's what's going to happen, Delilah continued. I'm going to keep living at Blackthorn Ranch. I'm going to keep cooking and working and taking up exactly as much space as I want. And you're going to face justice for murdering my father. Maybe not today, maybe not next week, but eventually. She stepped back. And when you do, I'll be there watching, because I want to see your face when you finally realize that money can't save you from the truth. Then she turned and walked away. Colt followed, keeping himself between Delilah and Silas until they reached the horses. Behind them, Silas stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by watching townspeople, his face twisted with rage. And for the first time in 6 years, Delilah Boone wasn't the one walking away ashamed. They rode back to Blackthorn Ranch in silence that felt heavier than the snow falling around them. Delilah's hand shook on the reins, not from cold, but from adrenaline finally catching up to her. She just confronted Silas Grady in front of half of Red Hollow, called him a murderer, challenged him publicly. There would be consequences. Colt noticed her trembling and slowed his horse until they were riding side by side. You all right? No. Delilah's voice came out rougher than intended. I'm terrified. I just declared war on a man who's already tried to kill me twice. You declared the truth. There's a difference. Tell that to my father's grave. Colt reached over and took her hand, squeezing once. Your father fought alone. You're not alone. The words helped, but only marginally. Delilah knew how this worked. Silas would retaliate. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But soon. And next time he wouldn't send hired guns who could be traced back to him. Next time would be personal. They reached the ranch as afternoon light started failing. Clara and May rushed out to meet them, questions tumbling over each other about what happened in town. Aunt Judith stood in the barn doorway, reading Delilah's expression with the accuracy of someone who'd survived her own share of dangerous men. It went badly, Judith said. Not a question. It went honestly, Delilah replied. Which might be the same thing. That night they ate dinner huddled around the makeshift stove in the barn. The meal was sparse, more of the salvage supplies running low, portions getting smaller as Delilah tried to make everything last until they could get to town again. Nobody complained, but Delilah saw May eyeing the pot like she was still hungry when her bowl was empty. Colt noticed too. I'll hunt tomorrow, he said. Get us some fresh meat. Maybe deer, maybe elk if I can find one. You shouldn't go alone, Delilah said. I've been hunting alone for 3 years. That was before Silas knew where you lived. Colt set down his spoon. He's not going to ambush me in the mountains. Too risky. If I disappear, Brennan will investigate. Silas is smart enough to know that. Silas is smart enough to make it look like an accident. Then I'll be careful. The conversation had that tone that meant neither of them would change their mind, so Delilah dropped it. But she spent the rest of dinner planning what she'd do if Colt didn't come back, where she'd take her sisters, how she'd protect them. The familiar calculus of survival that had become second nature over the past year. After everyone else went to sleep, Delilah and Colt sat near the dying fire, pressed close for warmth. The barn was drafty despite their best efforts, cold seeping through gaps in the walls, their breath visible in lamplight. Tell me about Emily, Delilah said quietly. Colt went very still. Why? Because you loved her. Because she's part of what made you into who you are now, and because I want to know. For a long moment, Colt didn't respond. Then he said, She was nothing like you. Delilah flinched slightly. I didn't mean... That's not an insult. Colt shifted so he could look at her. Emily was small, delicate, the kind of woman men write poetry about. She played piano, sang in the church choir, never raised her voice even when she was angry. He stared into the fire. And she was terrified of me. Not obviously, but I could tell. The way she'd flinch when I moved too fast, the way she'd apologize if she disagreed with something I said, like she was afraid I'd hurt her if she pushed back. Would you have? Never. But she didn't know that. Or maybe she did, and fear was just habit by then. Colt's jaw tightened. I thought love meant protecting someone fragile, keeping them safe from everything ugly in the world. But what I didn't understand was that you can't build a life with someone who's afraid of you. Delilah stayed quiet, letting him continue. When she died, parts of me was relieved, and I hated myself for that. Hated that my first thought after finding her body wasn't grief. It was the realization that I'd been lonely even when she was alive. Because you can't really love someone who makes themselves small around you. He turned to face Delilah fully. But you don't make yourself small. You take up space and dare people to have a problem with it. You argue with me when you think I'm wrong. You walk into general stores where people mock you and buy supplies anyway. And you stood in the middle of Red Hollow today and called out a man who could have you killed without breaking a sweat. Colt's hand found hers in the darkness. That's why I love you. Not in spite of your size or your stubbornness or your refusal to be what people expect, but because of it. Because you're the first person I've met who doesn't need me to be softer or harder or different. You just need me to be honest. Delilah felt tears burning behind her eyes. I need you to stay alive too. Working on it. I'm serious, Colt. If you die protecting me, I'll never forgive you. Noted. I mean it. I know you do. Colt pulled her closer, tucking her against his chest. But I'm not planning to die. I'm planning to rebuild this ranch, marry you if you'll have me, and make Silas Grady regret every decision that brought him into our lives. Delilah's breath caught. Marry me? Eventually, once this is over, unless you object to marrying a man whose house is currently a pile of charred wood. I object to you proposing in a barn that smells like horse manure. Fair, I'll ask again somewhere nicer. Promise? Promise. Delilah kissed him, slow and thorough, trying to memorize the feeling in case tomorrow brought something terrible. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, she whispered, Don't go hunting tomorrow. Stay here, please. We need food. We'll ration better? Delilah, please. The desperation in her voice must have reached him because Colt sighed and nodded. All right, no hunting tomorrow. But if we run out of supplies before the week's out, we're having this conversation again. Deal. They sat together until the fire burned down to embers, neither wanting to move, neither wanting to acknowledge that sleep meant separating into different corners of the barn where propriety demanded unmarried couples shouldn't share space. Finally, Aunt Judith's voice cut through the darkness. For heaven's sake, just sleep next to each other. You're both adults and we're living in a barn. I think conventional morality took a vacation the night our house burned down. Clara giggled from her corner. Delilah felt her face heat. Aunt Judith? Oh. Don't Aunt Judith me. I'm too old to pretend I don't notice you two making eyes at each other every minute of every day. Either commit to the romance or commit to separate corners. But stop this middle ground nonsense. It's exhausting to watch. Colt coughed, which might have been covering a laugh. Fine, Delilah said, giving up. We'll sleep next to each other. Thank you. Now everyone be quiet. I'm trying to rest before Silas sends more idiots to kill us. Delilah and Colt settled together on a pile of blankets near the stove, her back against his chest, his arm wrapped around her waist. It wasn't comfortable. The ground was hard and cold seeped through their bedding, but it was warm and safe. Or at least it felt safe until 3 days later, when everything went sideways. The attack came at dawn. Not fire this time, not bullets. Poison. Delilah woke to the sound of horses screaming in the corral. She bolted upright, disoriented, Colt already moving toward the barn door with his rifle. Outside, chaos. The horses thrashed against the fence, eyes rolling white, foam dripping from their mouths. 2 were already down, convulsing in the snow. The others kicked and bit at nothing, clearly in agony. What's happening? Clara shouted from behind them. Colt ran toward the corral, but stopped when he saw what Delilah had already noticed. Grain scattered across the feeding trough. Grain that looked wrong, too dark, too wet. Don't touch it, Colt ordered. Don't touch anything. But it was too late for the horses. Within 20 minutes, 5 were dead. The remaining 3 suffered until Colt had no choice but to end it mercifully with shots that echoed across the valley like accusations. When it was over, Colt stood in the corral surrounded by dead animals, his face carved from stone. Delilah approached slowly. Colt, strychnine, probably mixed into the grain last night. His voice was flat, empty. Someone snuck onto the property while we were sleeping and poisoned our animals. Silas. Has to be. Nobody else wants us gone this badly. But why horses? Why not? Delilah's stomach turned cold. Why not us? Colt looked at her and she saw the same realization settling in his eyes. Because killing us would bring too much attention. But killing our horses? That's just bad luck. Tainted feed could have happened to anyone. Except it didn't happen to anyone, it happened to us. Exactly. Delilah looked at the dead horses, at the grain scattered across the trough, at the mountain surrounding them, where someone had crept close enough to murder their animals. We can't stay here. We're not leaving. Colt, we have no horses, no transportation. If something happens, if someone gets hurt, we can't ride for help. Then we find new horses. With what money? We spent everything on winter supplies. Colt didn't have an answer for that. Behind them, Clara and May stood crying. Aunt Judith looked pale, her hand pressed against her chest like her heart was struggling. This was what Silas wanted. Not their deaths, not yet, but their slow destruction, their resources stripped away piece by piece until they had no choice but to abandon Blackthorn Ranch and everything they'd built. I'm going to town, Colt said finally. For what? To buy horses on credit. Jeremiah Crow mentioned he wanted my water rights. Maybe he'll front me the money for animals if it means keeping me here long enough to negotiate. Delilah wanted to argue, wanted to say accepting help from Jeremiah was dangerous, but they needed horses. Needed transportation, and pride was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. I'll come with you, she said. No, you stay here with your family. Colt, someone needs to guard the property, and if Silas is watching, I want him to see that we're not both gone at the same time. Makes us less vulnerable. The logic made sense, but Delilah hated it. Hated the idea of Colt riding into Red Hollow alone, where Silas could arrange another accident. Hated feeling helpless. But she nodded. Colt kissed her quickly, grabbed his rifle, and started walking toward town. No horse, no wagon, just boots crunching through snow and the long walk ahead of him. Delilah watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned to her sisters. We need to bury the horses, she said quietly. All of them? May asked, her voice small. All of them. We can't leave them like this. It took the rest of the day. The ground was frozen solid, so they couldn't dig graves. Instead, they dragged the bodies to the far edge of the property and covered them with rocks and branches to keep scavengers away. Brutal work, exhausting work, work that left all of them with bleeding hands and aching backs. By the time Colt returned just before sunset, Delilah was ready to collapse. He came back with 2 horses. Not great animals. One was old and the other had a slight limp, but alive, functional, enough to provide basic transportation. Jeremiah gave you credit? Delilah asked. In exchange for water access negotiations come spring. I didn't agree to sell, just to discuss it. Colt dismounted stiffly. He also said something interesting. Said Silas has been asking around town about hiring men. Not professional killers this time. Just ranch hands willing to work for good money. Why would he need ranch hands? That's what worries me. Either he's planning to settle here permanently, or he's building up forces for something bigger. Delilah felt cold settle deeper in her bones. We can't fight an army. No, but we can make sure the law knows what he's planning before he acts on it. The law hasn't helped us yet. Brennan's waiting on a response from Montana Territory. Once that comes through, he'll have jurisdiction to arrest Silas. And if the response never comes? If someone in Montana is protecting Silas? Colt didn't answer because they both knew it was possible. That night, Delilah couldn't sleep. She lay next to Colt in the barn, listening to the wind howl outside, and tried to figure out what came next. They'd survived fire, survived gunfights, survived poisoned horses, but each attack stripped away more of their resources, more of their ability to endure. Eventually, something would break. She just hoped it wasn't them. 2 weeks crawled past in tense anticipation. Every morning, Delilah woke expecting another attack. Every night, Colt checked the property for signs of intrusion. But nothing happened. No fire, no poison, no riders in the hills. Just silence. It felt worse than violence. During those 2 weeks, Colt started rebuilding. Not the house. They didn't have materials for that yet. But he reinforced the barn, fixed fences, and prepared for spring as if they'd definitely still be there to see it. Delilah watched him work and wondered if he really believed they'd survive, or if this was just how he dealt with fear. Probably both. Clara and May settled into the strange rhythm of their new life. They helped with chores, practiced reading in the limited lamplight, and slowly stopped jumping at every unexpected sound. Aunt Judith improved enough to start complaining about the accommodations, which Delilah took as a good sign. And through it all, Delilah cooked with diminishing supplies, rationed carefully, and tried not to think about what would happen when the food ran out. Then one morning, Sheriff Brennan arrived at Blackthorn Ranch with news. He rode up alone, dismounted, and stood in the snow looking uncomfortable. "Miss Boone, Colt." "Sheriff," Colt said warily, "what brings you out here?" "Got a response from Montana Territory. About your father's case." Delilah's heart hammered. "And?" Brennan pulled out a folded letter. "The marshal up there says there's insufficient evidence to pursue murder charges against Silas Grady. The local doctor ruled your father's death as natural causes. No witnesses came forward to contradict that. And the forged documents you claim exist. They can't find the originals to compare against." The world tilted. "That's impossible," Delilah said. "I have the original deed. I gave it to you." "I know. But the Montana authorities say their records show your father signed a legal sale agreement 3 days before he died. Everything properly notarized and witnessed." "By who?" "By the town clerk and a local rancher named Thomas Webb. Thomas Webb died 2 years ago in a riding accident." Brennan's expression tightened. "I'm aware, which makes his testimony difficult to verify." Colt stepped forward. "So what are you saying? That Silas gets away with murder because he bribed or killed everyone who could testify against him?" "I'm saying the Montana Territory has closed its investigation. They consider the matter resolved." "And here, in Wyoming?" "Here. I don't have jurisdiction over a crime that happened in Montana. All I can do is investigate the attacks on your property, which so far have no evidence linking them to Silas Grady." "We know it's him," Delilah said desperately. "Knowing and proving are different things. Unless you can give me physical evidence, witnesses, documents, something concrete, my hands are tied." Colt's jaw worked. "So Silas wins." "I didn't say that. I said we need better evidence." "How are we supposed to get evidence when everyone who could provide it is dead or bought off?" Brennan didn't have an answer. He left shortly after, his apologies meaning nothing against the weight of what he delivered. Delilah stood in the snow, watching him ride away, and felt something inside her crack. Not break, just crack, like ice under too much pressure. "We should leave," she said quietly. Colt looked at her. "What?" "We should take my sisters and aunt and leave. Go somewhere Silas won't find us. Start over." "No. Colt, we can't win this. The law won't help us. We have no proof. And Silas has unlimited resources to keep attacking until we're dead or broken. Running is the only smart option left. Running means he wins. Living means we survive." They stared at each other, the fundamental disagreement sitting heavy between them. Finally, Colt said, "I'm not leaving. This is my land, my home. And I'm done letting powerful men take things from me because they think they can." "Even if staying gets you killed?" "Even then," Delilah wanted to scream, wanted to shake him, wanted to make him understand that pride wasn't worth dying for. But she also understood something else. Colt had already lost too much in his life. His fiancée, his peace, his ability to trust. And Blackthorn Ranch was the one thing he had left that was truly his. Asking him to abandon it was asking him to abandon himself. "Then I'm staying too," she said. "Delilah." "Don't. If you're staying, I'm staying. We survive together or we don't survive at all." Colt pulled her close, holding tight like she might disappear if he let go. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I can't give you the safety you deserve. I don't want safety. I want you. And I want Silas Grady to face consequences for what he's done. We might not get both. Then we'll settle for what we can get." That night, Delilah made a decision. If the law wouldn't help them, she'd find another way. She waited until everyone was asleep, then quietly extracted a piece of paper from their limited supplies and began writing. Not a letter, a testimony. Everything that happened, every detail about her father's death, Silas's threats, the forged documents, the attacks on Blackthorn Ranch. Every single thing she could remember, dated and signed. When she finished, she had 10 pages of meticulous documentation. Not legal evidence, exactly, but truth, raw and unvarnished. She folded the pages carefully and tucked them into her coat. Tomorrow she'd ride to Red Hollow. She'd give copies to the newspaper, to the town council, to anyone who'd listen. And if official justice wouldn't touch Silas Grady, maybe public shame would. It was a desperate plan, probably stupid, likely dangerous. But it was something. And Delilah Boone was done doing nothing while men decided her fate. Delilah rode into Red Hollow the next morning before Colt woke up. She left a note saying she'd gone for supplies, which was technically true even if it wasn't the whole truth. The pages of testimony sat heavy in her coat pocket, each one a potential death sentence if Silas found out what she was planning. The town was quiet at this hour. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks. A few early risers moved between buildings. And the newspaper office, a cramped building at the end of Main Street, showed lamplight through its windows. Delilah tied her horse and walked inside. The editor was a man named Peter Hutchins, 40-something with ink-stained fingers and the permanent squint of someone who read too much in poor light. He looked up when the door opened, his expression cycling through surprise, curiosity, and wariness when he recognized her. "Miss Boone?" he said carefully. "Didn't expect to see you here. I have a story for you. I don't publish gossip. This isn't gossip, it's documentation." Delilah pulled out the folded pages and set them on his desk. "Everything that happened to my family. Everything Silas Grady has done, dates, names, details. All of it true." Hutchins picked up the pages and scanned the first few lines. His expression shifted. "These are serious accusations. They're facts. Facts that could get me sued. Or worse. Or they could expose a murderer who thinks money makes him untouchable." Hutchins set down the pages. "Miss Boone, I sympathize with your situation, truly, but printing this would destroy my paper. Silas Grady has connections, resources. He'd bury me in lawsuits before the ink dried. So you're going to let him get away with it, just like everyone else? I'm going to protect my livelihood, same as you're trying to protect yours." Delilah felt frustration burning hot in her chest. What's the point of having a newspaper if you're too afraid to print the truth? The truth without proof is just slander. You bring me concrete evidence, witnesses willing to testify, official documents, something beyond your word, and I'll consider it. But I won't destroy my life because you need someone to fight your battles. The words stung because they were partially right. She was asking him to risk everything for her. No proof beyond her testimony. No guarantee it would even matter. But she also knew that if people like Hutchins kept choosing safety over truth, men like Silas would keep winning. "Fine," Delilah said quietly. She picked up her pages and walked toward the door. "When Silas comes for you eventually, because men like him always do, I hope someone has more courage than you're showing right now." She left before he could respond. Outside, the morning had warmed slightly. Snow melted in patches, revealing frozen mud underneath. Delilah stood on the sidewalk trying to figure out what to do next when a voice called her name. Jeremiah Crow approached from across the street, his expensive coat making him look out of place among the working ranchers and shopkeepers. "Miss Boone," he said her, "heard you were in town. News travels fast." "Always does." Jeremiah gestured toward the saloon. "Buy you breakfast?" Delilah hesitated. Jeremiah wasn't her enemy exactly, but he wasn't her friend either. Still, she was hungry and curious about what he wanted. "All right." They sat in the saloon's back corner where morning light struggled through dirty windows. Jeremiah ordered eggs and coffee for both of them, then leaned back in his chair and studied her. "You look like someone who just got told no," he said. "Hutchins won't print my testimony about Silas." "Can't say I blame him. Printing accusations against a man with Silas's resources is career suicide. So everyone just protects themselves and lets him destroy whoever he wants? That's generally how power works, yes." Delilah's hands curled into fists. "Then the system is broken. The system was never designed to protect people like you. It was designed to protect people like Silas and me, men with money and influence. The fact that it occasionally helps others is coincidental. That's a cynical view. It's an honest view." Jeremiah paused while the bartender delivered their food. "But that doesn't mean the system can't be manipulated if you know how." Delilah looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Silas made a mistake coming to Red Hollow. He assumed his reputation would intimidate everyone into cooperation, But what he didn't account for was that I don't like being intimidated. And I especially don't like outsiders thinking they can operate in my territory without consequences. Your territory? I've been the biggest landowner in this valley for 15 years. I employ more men than anyone else. I have influence with the territorial government. And while I've certainly used that power for my own benefit, I also understand that maintaining it requires a certain level of community stability. He took a bite of eggs, chewed thoughtfully. Silas represents chaos. He attacks ranches, poisons livestock, burns buildings. That kind of behavior makes everyone nervous, makes investors question whether this valley is safe for business. And that hurts my interests. So you want to help me stop him because it's good for business? I want to help you stop him because watching him destroy Colt Mercer would set a precedent I can't allow. If Silas succeeds in taking Blackthorn Ranch through violence, what's to stop the next wealthy outsider from trying the same thing with my properties? Delilah set down her fork. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we give Sheriff Brennan the evidence he needs to arrest Silas, not your testimony. That won't hold up. But something concrete, something undeniable. Like what? Jeremiah smiled, and it wasn't a kind expression. Like catching him in the act of committing another crime. You want to use me as bait. I want to give Silas enough rope to hang himself. And yes, that requires you being in a position where he feels comfortable attacking. That's insane. Probably. But it's also the only way this ends without more people dying. Jeremiah leaned forward. Silas won't stop. You know that. He'll keep attacking until you leave or you're dead. The law can't touch him because he's covered his tracks too well. But if we can catch him ordering another attack, threatening you directly, anything that gives Brennan legal justification, then we can end this. Delilah wanted to say no, wanted to walk away from this dangerous, half-formed plan. But Jeremiah was right about one thing. Silas wouldn't stop, and waiting for him to make another move meant more people getting hurt. What do you need from me? She asked quietly. I need you to attend the town council meeting tomorrow night, publicly. Make sure Silas knows you'll be there. And I need you to trust that I'll have people in position to witness whatever he does next. And if he doesn't do anything, if he's smart enough to recognize a trap, then we try something else. But men like Silas have a fatal flaw. They believe their own invincibility. He's gotten away with so much for so long that he thinks he's untouchable, and that arrogance will be what destroys him. Delilah thought about Colt, about her sisters, about everything they'd already survived. Then she thought about her father dying alone because he refused to surrender to threats. All right, she said. I'll be there. Good. And Miss Boone? Jeremiah's expression turned serious. Whatever happens tomorrow night, don't trust anyone except Colt and Sheriff Brennan. Not even me. Because if this goes wrong, I'll deny ever having this conversation. Understood. They finished breakfast in silence. When Delilah left the saloon, she felt like she'd just made a deal with something dangerous. But desperation made strange allies, and she was desperate enough to bet everything on one final confrontation. She rode back to Blackthorn Ranch, rehearsing how to tell Colt what she'd agreed to. He wouldn't like it, would probably try to stop her, but she'd made up her mind, and Colt knew her well enough by now to recognize when arguing was pointless. He was waiting when she arrived, standing in the barn doorway with his arms crossed, and an expression that suggested he knew she'd been up to something. Supplies take 4 hours now? He asked. I made a stop. Where? Delilah dismounted and told him everything. The failed attempt with Hutchins, the conversation with Jeremiah, the plan for tomorrow night. She watched Colt's face cycle through anger, frustration, and resignation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, you know, this is probably a trap. I know. Jeremiah could be working with Silas. This could be a setup to get you alone where they can eliminate you without witnesses. It could be, but it could also be our only chance to end this. Colt scrubbed his hands over his face. I hate this. I hate that you're the one taking the risk. I hate that we're desperate enough to trust Jeremiah Crow. I know. If something happens to you, then you take care of my sisters and make sure Silas pays for it. Delilah stepped closer. But nothing's going to happen. Because I'll have you watching my back, because Brennan will be there, and because for the first time since this started, we're not just reacting, we're planning. Colt pulled her into his arms and held tight. I love you, and I'm terrified of losing you. I love you too, and I'm terrified of living the rest of my life running from Silas Grady. So let's end this." The next day crawled past with agonizing slowness. Delilah tried to keep busy, cooking, organizing, helping Clara and May with chores, but her mind kept drifting to the town council meeting. What she'd say, how Silas would react, whether Jeremiah's plan would work or backfire spectacularly. Colt checked his weapons repeatedly, cleaned his rifle, loaded extra ammunition. The methodical preparation of a man who expected violence. As sunset approached, they got ready to ride into Red Hollow. Clara and May hugged Delilah tight, their young faces showing fear they tried to hide. Aunt Judith just squeezed her hand and said, "You're stronger than any of them. Remember that." The ride to town was tense. Colt rode close, scanning the landscape for threats. Delilah kept her hand near the knife she'd started carrying after the first attack. Neither spoke much because there wasn't much to say that hadn't already been said. Red Hollow was busy when they arrived. The town council met monthly to discuss local issues, and people gathered from surrounding ranches to participate or observe. Wagons lined the street, lamplight spilled from the community hall. And somewhere in that crowd, Silas Grady waited. Delilah and Colt dismounted and walked toward the hall. People watched them pass, some with sympathy, some with curiosity, some with barely concealed hostility. The tension was thick enough to taste. Inside, the hall was packed. Rows of chairs faced a raised platform where council members sat behind a long table. Jeremiah was there, along with 4 other local landowners who made decisions affecting the valley. And in the back corner, arms crossed and smiling like he owned the place, stood Silas Grady. Their eyes met across the room. Silas's smile widened. Delilah forced herself to look away and find a seat. Colt sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. She could feel the coiled tension in his body, the barely restrained violence waiting for an excuse. The meeting started with mundane business: water rights disputes, fence boundary disagreements, a proposal to repair the main road before spring mud made it impassable. Delilah listened without hearing, her focus on Silas. He hadn't moved, just stood there watching her like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Then Jeremiah called for new business. Delilah stood before she could second-guess herself. "I have something to address." The room went quiet. Jeremiah nodded. "Go ahead, Miss Boone." Delilah walked to the front, acutely aware of every eye on her. She'd prepared a speech, rehearsed it a dozen times. But standing there with Silas watching and the entire town waiting, the prepared words evaporated. So she spoke from the heart instead. "Most of you know who I am, Delilah Boone, the fat woman who showed up last winter and somehow convinced Colt Mercer to give her shelter." She paused, letting the description sit. "That's what people have been calling me anyway. The fat cook, the burden, the woman too big to deserve respect." Someone in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. "But here's what you don't know. My father owned land in Montana Territory, good land with oil deposits. A man named Silas Grady wanted that land. When my father refused to sell, Silas had him killed and forged documents claiming ownership." Murmurs rippled through the room. "My family has been running ever since. 8 months of moving from town to town, staying one step ahead of the men Silas sends to eliminate witnesses. We came to Red Hollow, hoping distance would keep us safe. But Silas followed. And 2 weeks ago, his hired guns attacked Blackthorn Ranch, burned the house, tried to kill everyone inside." Silas stepped forward. "That's a serious accusation with no proof." "I have proof." Delilah held up the land deed she'd reclaimed from Sheriff Brennan. "Original documents showing my father's legal ownership. Documents that directly contradict the forged papers Silas used to steal our property. Those could be forgeries themselves." "They're not. Sheriff Brennan verified them. So did the county recorder in Montana. The only reason Silas hasn't been arrested yet is because the witnesses who could testify against him are all dead or too scared to speak." The room erupted in conversation. Jeremiah banged his gavel. "Order, let her finish." Delilah turned to face the crowd fully. "I'm done being quiet about what Silas Grady did. I'm done letting shame about my body distract from his crimes. And I'm done running. If this town values justice at all, you'll support Sheriff Brennan's investigation. You'll stop treating Silas like a respectable businessman and start seeing him for what he really is, a murderer who uses money and influence to escape consequences." She sat down. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Then Silas laughed. That was quite a performance, very emotional. But emotion isn't evidence. And unless you can prove I did anything illegal, you're just a desperate woman making noise. Colt started to stand, but Delilah grabbed his arm. Not yet. Silas continued, addressing the council now. I came to Red Hollow with legitimate business interests. I've been nothing but respectful to this community. And in return, I've been accused of murder, arson, and conspiracy based on the word of a woman who's clearly unstable. Unstable? Delilah's voice cut through the room. Is that what you call someone who refuses to be silent about your crimes? I call it delusional. You've constructed an elaborate fiction where I'm the villain and you're the victim. But the truth is simpler. Your father died of natural causes. His land was sold legally, and you've been harassing me ever since because you can't accept reality. Then explain the attack on Blackthorn Ranch. I can't explain something I had nothing to do with. Maybe you made enemies somewhere else. Maybe Colt Mercer's violent reputation finally caught up with him. Either way, it's not my problem. The confidence in his voice was infuriating. He genuinely believed he was untouchable. And that's when Delilah understood Jeremiah's plan. She stood again. You're right about one thing, Silas. I can't prove what you did in Montana. The witnesses are dead. The evidence has been buried. But I can prove what you're planning to do here. Silas's expression flickered. I'm not planning anything. Really? Because I heard you've been hiring men, building up forces, preparing for something bigger than poisoning a few horses. Hiring ranch hands isn't a crime. It is when you're hiring them to attack civilians. I'm not... Then let Sheriff Brennan search your property. If you're innocent, you have nothing to hide. The room went silent again. Silas's face hardened. I don't have to submit to illegal searches based on wild accusations. Scared of what he might find? I'm not scared of anything. Prove it. They stared at each other across the room. Then Silas made his mistake. He stepped toward Delilah, close enough that people in the front row heard when he said quietly, You should be careful, Miss Boone. Accidents happen to people who make themselves targets. It wasn't quite a threat, not explicit enough for legal action, but Delilah had expected something like this. She stepped back and raised her voice. Did everyone hear that? Silas Grady just threatened me publicly. I did no such thing. You said accidents happen to people who make themselves targets. That's a threat. It's a statement of fact. This frontier is dangerous. People die all the time. People you've killed. Silas's control finally cracked. He grabbed Delilah's arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. You need to shut your mouth before... He didn't finish the sentence because Colt's fist connected with his face. Silas went down hard, blood streaming from his nose. The room erupted into chaos. Men shouted, women screamed, and Colt stood over Silas with murder in his eyes. Touch her again, Colt said quietly, and I'll kill you where you stand. Sheriff Brennan pushed through the crowd. Everyone calm down. Colt, step back. Colt didn't move. Brennan positioned himself between them. I said step back. Slowly, Colt retreated, but his eyes never left Silas. Brennan helped Silas to his feet. You all right? Silas wiped blood from his face. I want him arrested for assault. You grabbed Miss Boone first. That's assault. He was defending her. She provoked me. With words, which isn't illegal. Brennan's expression hardened. But threatening a civilian in front of 50 witnesses is. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave this meeting. You're going to stay away from Miss Boone and Blackthorn Ranch, and you're going to make yourself available for questioning regarding the attacks on that property. I don't have to, Yes, you do. Because if you refuse, I'll arrest you for obstruction and threatening behavior. Your choice. Silas looked around the room. Whatever support he expected to find wasn't there. People were watching him with suspicion now, not respect. Delilah's testimony had planted seeds of doubt, and his loss of control had watered them. Fine, Silas spat. But this isn't over. He left, his hired men following close behind. When the door closed, the room exhaled collectively. Jeremiah stood. I think that concludes tonight's business. Meeting adjourned. People filed out slowly, conversations buzzing. Delilah stood trembling in the aftermath, Colt's hand steady on her shoulder. Brennan approached. That was reckless. It was necessary, Delilah replied. Maybe, but you just made yourself an even bigger target. I've been a target since the day I refused to disappear quietly. At least now people know why. Brennan sighed. Get home, stay alert, and if Silas makes another move, you send for me immediately." They left the hall and walked toward their horses. The night had turned cold again, snow starting to fall in lazy spirals. Delilah felt exhausted down to her bones. But also something else. Hope. Not certainty, not victory, just the fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, speaking truth to power actually mattered. They were halfway home when Colt spotted the riders. 6 men, maybe more, spread across the road ahead, blocking their path. In the center, unmistakable even in darkness, sat Silas Grady. "Delilah," Colt said quietly. "When I say run, you run. Don't look back. Just get to town and find Brennan. I'm not leaving you." "You don't have a choice." Silas urged his horse forward. "Going somewhere?" Colt's hand moved to his rifle. "Out of our way, Silas." "I don't think so. See, I've been patient. I've played by rules. I've tried to handle this legally. But you two keep pushing. Keep making noise. Keep making me look bad." "You make yourself look bad." "Maybe. But I'm done being patient." Silas gestured to his men. "Here's what's going to happen. Miss Boone is going to come with us quietly. She's going to sign over her father's land rights, and then she's going to disappear, permanently." "Over my dead body," Colt said. "That can be arranged." The men spread out, surrounding them. Delilah's heart hammered. This was it. The final confrontation. Everything had been building toward this moment. Colt raised his rifle. "Last chance to walk away, Silas. I could say the same to you. Difference is, I'm not bluffing. Neither am I." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then gunfire shattered the night. But it didn't come from Silas's men. It came from the trees. Sheriff Brennan emerged from the darkness with a dozen deputies, rifles raised. "Nobody move. Silas Grady, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, threatening behavior, and attempted kidnapping." Silas's face went white. "You can't." "I can. And I am. Thanks to Miss Boone's bravery in drawing you out. I now have 50 witnesses who heard you threaten her. And thanks to Jeremiah Crow's cooperation, I have men who witnessed you planning this ambush tonight." Jeremiah stepped from the shadows, his expression grim. "Told you arrogance would be your downfall, Silas." Silas looked around wildly. His men were already surrendering, hands raised, realizing they'd been caught in an operation that had been planned for days. "This is a setup," Silas snarled. "This is justice," Brennan corrected. "Get off your horse." Slowly. Silas dismounted, his confidence finally cracking. "My lawyers will—" "Your lawyers can meet you in jail." Brennan motioned to his deputies. "Take him." They dragged Silas away, his protests fading into the distance. Delilah sat on her horse, shaking so badly she could barely hold the reins. Colt moved beside her, his hand finding hers. "It's over," he said quietly. "Is it?" "The Montana Marshal is sending men to investigate based on tonight's arrest. Brennan found witnesses willing to testify now that Silas can't threaten them, and Jeremiah's agreed to fund a legal defense team if needed." Delilah looked at Jeremiah. "Why?" "Because Silas threatened my valley's stability, and because watching you stand up to him reminded me that power without principle is just tyranny." Jeremiah tipped his hat. "Good luck, Miss Boone. You're braver than most men I know." He left before she could respond. Brennan approached. "You did good tonight. Risky, but good. Will it stick, the arrest?" "Between the public threats, the attempted kidnapping, and the Montana evidence we're uncovering, yes, it'll stick." Brennan smiled slightly. Silas Grady's reign of terror is over. They rode back to Blackthorn Ranch as dawn started breaking. Pink and gold light spilled across the valley, illuminating the burned remains of the house, the makeshift barn shelter, the hard-won land they'd defended with everything they had. Clara and May rushed out when they arrived, questions tumbling over each other. Aunt Judith stood in the doorway, reading the answer in Delilah's expression before anyone spoke. "It's over," Delilah confirmed. "Silas has been arrested." May burst into tears. Clara hugged her sister tight, and Aunt Judith just nodded like she'd known all along that Delilah was too stubborn to let evil win. That night, they celebrated with the last of their supplies. A meager meal by any standard, but it tasted like victory. Afterward, when everyone else went to sleep, Delilah and Colt sat outside under stars that seemed brighter than usual. "What happens now?" Delilah asked. "Now we rebuild. The house. The ranch. Everything. Colt paused. And I ask you properly this time. He stood and pulled Delilah to her feet. Then he got down on one knee in the snow. Delilah Boone, you're the strongest person I've ever met. You walked into my life when I'd given up on feeling anything except anger and loneliness. You made my house a home. You fought battles you shouldn't have had to fight, and you never once made yourself smaller to make other people comfortable. His hand found hers. I love you, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. And I'm asking, will you marry me? Will you stay here and build a life with me? Will you keep taking up space and being brilliant and reminding me every day that love isn't weakness? Delilah pulled him to his feet. Yes. They kissed under stars and falling snow, two broken people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment. The next months brought change. Silas Grady was convicted of murder, fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. His properties were sold, the money distributed to families he'd harmed. The Boone family land in Montana was returned to Delilah. She sold it for enough money to rebuild Blackthorn Ranch properly. A real house this time, with enough rooms for everyone and windows that let in light. Red Hollow slowly changed its attitude. The women who'd mocked Delilah started treating her with wary respect. The men who'd dismissed her realized she'd done what they were too scared to attempt, and the town council officially recognized her role in exposing corruption. But the most important changes happened quietly. Clara and May finished their education and started helping run the ranch. Aunt Judith lived 3 more years, long enough to see Delilah and Colt married, long enough to know her family was safe. And Delilah herself transformed in ways that had nothing to do with appearance. She stopped apologizing for existing, stopped making herself small, stopped accepting that her worth depended on other people's approval, because she'd learned something important during that brutal winter. The world would always have people who tried to diminish her. Men like Silas who saw her size as weakness. Women who weaponized her appearance to feel better about themselves. Systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. But none of that mattered as much as what she believed about herself. And she believed she was strong, capable, worthy of love exactly as she was. 5 years later, travelers still talked about the legendary couple at Blackthorn Ranch, the feared gunslinger who'd learned that love was survival, and the plus-sized woman who'd brought down a corrupt empire with nothing except courage and truth. Children in Red Hollow grew up hearing Delilah's story. Young girls who felt too big, too loud, too much learned that those qualities could be strengths instead of flaws. And the valley itself became a place where standing up to injustice mattered more than maintaining comfortable silence. On quiet evenings, Colt and Delilah would sit on their porch watching sunset paint the mountains gold. Sometimes they'd talk about the past. Sometimes they'd plan for the future. But mostly they'd just exist together, comfortable in the space they'd fought so hard to claim. You ever regret it? Colt asked one evening. Everything we went through? Delilah considered the question. The burned house, the dead horses, the nights of terror, the public humiliation, the fight that almost killed them both. No, she said finally, because all of it taught me who I really am and who I want to be. Which is? Someone who takes up space without apologizing. Someone who fights back when powerful people assume they can take whatever they want. Someone who loves hard and refuses to disappear. Colt kissed her hand. The whole town used to think you were too much woman for any man. Delilah smiled, remembering the conversation they'd had years ago. And now? Now they know I was never man enough for you. But I'm learning. They sat together as stars emerged one by one, two people who'd survived the worst and found something better on the other side. Not perfection, not easy happiness. Just the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to let other people's cruelty define your worth. And that love, real love, doesn't ask you to be smaller. It asks you to be exactly who you are, in all your messy, complicated, beautiful truth. That was the legacy of Delilah Boone and the winter that changed everything. Not a fairy tale where problems disappeared with magic, but a real story about real people who fought real battles and won by refusing to surrender the one thing that truly mattered, themselves.